With the implosion of Atari in the USA and the downturn of arcades across the world, Sega looked to expand their video game empire beyond the arcade and licensing ports of their titles to other companies to use. And so, on the 15th of July 1983, Sega released not one, but two systems. The first was the SG1000, known as the Sega Computer, a fully featured 8-bit home micro with a keyboard and basic compiler software built to go head-to-head with the MSX. The other was a consoleized SG1000, which was essentially the same hardware but marketed as a games console first and foremost, and that console is going to be our focus today. Between the SG1000 and SG3000, there were a lot of games that were shared and compatible between the two systems, though a number actually required a keyboard, so were marketed exclusively as SG3000 titles. Interestingly, both Sega systems launched on the very same day and date as the Famicom in Japan, the maiden Nintendo console that would become the NES. So in this episode, we're going to look back at 7 launch games for the SG1000 and see how they played and whether they captured that Sega magic early enough to fight off the challenge from Nintendo. We'll kick things off with probably the most well-known title from this list, Congo Bongo. The original arcade game was an isometric platformer in which your safari-themed avatar navigates stages in order to catch a giant ape. The SG1000 had no hope in producing a fully faithful port of such an impressive arcade game, so instead it switches to a more traditional side-on view for one stage and a top-down perspective for another. Yes, there are actually only 2 alternating stages in this port compared to the 4 in the original arcade game. That being said, it's not a bad looking game at all, and it plays well, with an addictive gameplay hook which pushes you on as the stages grow in complexity. The enemy and trap placement can feel ruthless to the point of being unfair at times, but play enough and you'll see that there are patterns and solutions for everything. It's a fun game, and visually on par with what you'd see on the Commodore 64 and MSX at the time, but with an opening stage that bears more than a passing resemblance to Donkey Kong, you do feel that Congo Bongo may have suffered a little bit by comparison, despite its own individual merits. Next up is Champion Tennis. Now, since Pong kickstarted much of the video game craze in the US and later around the world, it's only right that Sega's first hardware saw a tennis game on its debut. So is this the classic that all-time racketing great virtual tennis can trace its lineage back to? Well, unfortunately not. As you can see from the footage, this is an incredibly basic looking tennis title. Okay, so Pong this is not, but the lack of a running animation on the players is more than a little jarring, and in all honesty, I think it looks worse than the animation you'd see on the Atari 2600 tennis title. The character models are extremely basic, and the black background and colour scheme makes it look more like a BBC micro game. Once the game is in full flow, I can't say that the gameplay saves it. I had trouble directing my shots, only able to hit them straight back at the CPU. I'm sure this one is perfectly fine for 2 players, but considering Nintendo's tennis game that came just a few months later, this isn't a strong showing for the SG1000. N-Sub is the next game we'll look at. When I first booted this up, I thought I was playing a port of Deep Scan, the excellent 1979 arcade game that appeared in Die Hard Arcade. But what we have here instead is a sort of spiritual successor that is the inverse of what Deep Scan was. So instead of playing as a ship dropping depth charges on submarines, you play a submarine blowing up ships on the water's surface. It plays very similarly to Deep Scan, but with you firing up instead of down. But there's a few other features that add to the experience. Firstly, ships can fire homing missiles at you, which you have to shoot down rather than avoid. And secondly, you have enemy subs beneath the surface with you, which you have to shoot down with the second fire button in the guise of a horizontal shoot 'em up. It's actually a great game and brilliant for score chasers, even if it doesn't give you credits for Die Hard Arcade. The next 2 games I'm going to cover at quite a high level because these are traditional Japanese games that require knowledge of the rules and the language. The first is Mahjong, which is exactly what it says it is. This is a Mahjong game, and it reminds me that I found a Mahjong parlour in Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth recently, so I should really use that to teach me how to play Mahjong, since this looks like a decent simulator for the game. The other game is Shogi, or Serizara Hachiden no Sumi Shogi, to give it its full name. Shogi is essentially a Japanese game very similar to chess. Once again, the rules and language barrier prevent me from getting full enjoyment from this one. And while I don't think it looks as nice as the Mahjong title, I'm sure there's a solid simulation here. Our penultimate game is Yamato, another ocean combat title. This time you control a warship that is tasked with shooting down both warplanes and enemy battleships as they rain down missiles and torpedoes on your position. Your first button fires your anti-air rockets and the second fires your torpedoes at enemy ships. This is further complicated by having two connected targeting reticules, one for each fire and enemy. Planes can only be shot down by missiles and ships can only be sunk with torpedoes, and you have to match the right target to the right ammunition to bring the enemy down. You do all this while avoiding all of the enemy fire and positioning your ship appropriately. It's tough and it feels a little like doing two things at once, but the frantic gameplay is actually enjoyable and it definitely has that classic score attack Sega hook. Not only that, but it's probably one of the most visually complex games of the launch lineup next to Congo Bongo. Finally, we have my favourite of the bunch, Starjacker. This is a vertically scrolling shoot 'em up along the lines of Xevious but with a twist. You take on enemies with not one but 4 ships, at least at the start. Firing causes all 4 of your ships to shoot, making you a real force to be reckoned with 4 shots firing from your squadron. However, your bunched up cruisers make you a bigger target, and a hit to any of those ships causes you to lose a life, reducing your count to 3, 2 or even 1 ship. You'll find that it's easier to avoid enemy fire as a result, but it becomes much harder to take down enemies with shots from a single spaceship. It's quite a brilliant and unique concept, and scraping through stages with just 1 ship, only to have another join you as an extra life, provides some much welcome relief. The game looks good, not amazing, but good enough, and it's a very faithful approximation of the arcade original, even featuring the zooming in of your squad and spaceships when a stage is completed, and the mothership that you launch from. Those were the 7 SG1000 games that launched with the console in 1983, and this quick whistle-stop tour demonstrates that overall, it wasn't a bad lineup. Yes, tennis was a letdown, and we had 2 fairly standard adaptations of traditional Japanese board games, but the rest of the titles were, on the whole, pretty good. 7 titles is also more than double the 3 available on Nintendo's Famicom on the same day and date, giving early Sega console players much more choice. However, there's a few challenges here. The first is the dual system approach, which you can imagine made sense at the time, with Sega dipping their toe into the home market and hedging their bets with the faltering but previously popular US console approach versus the seemingly unstoppable home computer approach which was popular in Europe and Japan. Whilst logical, you do feel that this dual system approach probably did cause some confusion in the market compared to the hyper-focused Nintendo Famicom. And speaking of which, we do have to touch on that Nintendo factor. There may have only been 3 games on Nintendo's Famicom, but they had better brand recognition and had already demonstrated a degree of visual superiority over the SG1000. Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr. and Popeye all feel a little bit more polished too over Sega's efforts, giving a focus on quality over quantity. You also have to take into account that the Famicom was 100 yen cheaper than Sega's effort as well, and you can see why Nintendo got that early advantage. Still, the SG1000 and SC3000 were actually financial successes for Sega of Japan, the latter even getting a limited international release and a load more software. Even with these first efforts, you can see some of that Sega magic shining through. And playing them now, I feel like Sega really were back then on the cusp of something really special, because the SG1000 is in the DNA of nearly every Sega console that followed, and there's a warmth to playing these games in the here and now. So that's it then. We hope you've enjoyed this tour of the SG1000's launch titles, and hey, if you'd like to see more SG1000 action, let us know in the comments below. And if you feel like being extra awesome, give us a like and a subscribe, and maybe think about becoming a member. But that's all, until next time, this has been Dan the Mega Driver of the Sega Guys, and we will see you on the Sega side.